I would venture to say that approaching the Christian story from this direction, it has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect, as to others, of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, particularly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect, self contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of it has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. To reject it leads either to sadness or to wrath. So, just to break down, some key terms here. For those of you who aren't aware, this is something we've talked about a lot on this podcast. But the idea of eucatastrophe is coined by Tolkien in this essay, and eucatastrophe really has to do with this idea of the happy turn. So the key thing, within Middle Earth, maybe think of whenever things look like it's all going to go bad, right? And all of a sudden the eagles show up, right? So in Middle Earth, eucatastrophe is usually like an eagle catastrophe, right? Because the eagles show up at just the right time and kind of save the day. You might think of if you think of Star Wars, right? The original Star Wars movie, it's when Luke, when Han Solo comes swooping in on the Millennium Falcon right when it looks like Luke's about to get shot down by Darth Vader and the Death Star is going to blow up Yavin, right? Or the rebel base on, I think it's Yavin, yeah. Anyway, when he's about to blow up, when the Death Star is about to blow up the rebel base, Han Solo comes swooping in unexpectedly and saves the day so that Luke can then blow up the Death Star, right? So that's the idea of the eucatastrophe. This happy turn in the events, like a major event that leads to a happy turn. So it's like the opposite of what we normally think of catastrophe as being like this big event that's really bad. It's almost like this big event that's really good, right? And so Tolkien talks about connects this all to the story of Christmas, right? To the birth of Christ. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, the big happy event of man's history, right? It turns it turns the tide of man's history away from death, from evil, from all these things, and turns it towards goodness, towards new life, towards all of the things that many things we take for granted these days. So Tolkien, is really calling out the birth of Christ. He's really putting his Christian faith forward here and saying, look, this is all connected for me to my faith, right? To Christianity, to my belief in the story of Jesus Christ. And we see, so you might wonder okay, well, what does that really have to do though with Middle Earth per se? Well, there's on one hand, there's kind of like some little sort of interesting little tidbit connections. You got December 25th, 3018. That's when the Fellowship leaves Rivendell at dusk. You could kind of make the argument that okay, they're setting out from Rivendell on this mission that's going to require a lot of them. So that's kind of like the birth of Christ being born into this world so that he can eventually go through this passion, right? Some people have called the Lord of the Rings like the Passion of Frodo, right? So Frodo is starting out there from Rivendell. Christ starts out at his birth to live this life that will culminate in his death by crucifixion and then ultimately his resurrection, right? March 25th, we've talked about that a lot on this show. March 25th is the day the ring was destroyed. It's 9 months before December 25th, and it happens to be the date, the kind of traditional date of the Annunciation, which would have been the moment of Christ's conception in the womb of the Virgin Mary. So that is a very deliberate thing that Tolkien did, right? March 25th, tied to the destruction of the ring, and which is also tied to the Annunciation. And some people speculate that March 25th was also the date of the crucifixion of Christ. So you may have kind of a double meaning there. But even if we see to tie that to Christmas, excuse me, got a little Christmas cold going on, I guess. If we tie that to Christmas, March 25th leading up to December 25th, we can see December 25th is the culmination of these things, right? So, the kind of the fulfillment of the thing that was begun on March 25th. So, in the Christian scheme, it's the Annunciation, leading to the birth of Christ on December 25th, exactly 9 months later. In Middle Earth, we have the destruction. We have the destruction of the ring, which sets off these things that will result ultimately in the culmination much later in history of the incarnation. All right, now you're probably wondering how I got there. Okay, it actually fits with the legendarium of Middle Earth, and here's how we know. We go to this writing, this rather obscure writing, which we plan to cover here very soon on the Tolkien Road, uh, called Athrabeth Finrod Ah Andreth. So let me pull up this here so you can follow along again. Okay, so Athrabeth is a dialogue between Finrod and Andreth. Finrod, of course, is known to you if you've read the Silmarillion. He's the brother of Galadriel, one of the great elvish warriors of the First Age. And then we have Andreth, who is like kind of a wise woman. So she's a mortal, right? She's a man. She's of the race of men, but she is mortal. And so they're having this discussion, really about mortality, right? About why elves are immortal and men have these relatively short lives. And it's this really moving discussion they have, very fascinating too in terms of the legendarium. But what I want to highlight here from this discussion, there's so much more to say about it, but how this connects to Lord of the Rings and Christmas, to Middle Earth and Christmas, is that this part right here. So Andreth speaks of this old hope, right? So it's what she's talking about here is this some of the early men, right? Some of the early mortals, as they awoke, believed there was kind of this destiny that would lay far in the future, and she refers to that as the old hope. And Finrod here says, "Those of the old hope, who are they?" Andreth replies, "A few," she said, "but their number has grown since we came to this land, and they see that the nameless can, as they think, be defied." So the nameless here is Morgoth. "Yet that is no good reason. To defy him does not undo his work of old. And if the valor of the Eldar fails here, then their despair will be deeper, for it was not on the night of men or of any of the peoples of Arda that the old hope was grounded." "What then was this hope, if you know?" Finrod asked. "They say," answered Andreth, "they say that the One will himself enter into Arda, and heal men and all the marring from the beginning to the end. This they say also, or they feign, is a rumor that has come down through years uncounted, even from the days of our undoing." "They say, they feign," said Finrod. "Are you then not one of them?" "How can I be, Lord? All wisdom is against them. Who is the one whom ye call Eru? If we put aside the men who serve the Nameless, as do many in Middle Earth, still many men perceive the world only as a war between light and dark equipotent. But you will say, Nay, that is Manwë and Melkor. Eru is above them. Is then Eru only the greatest of the Valar, a great god among gods, as most men will say, even among the Atani? A king who dwells far from his kingdom and leaves lesser princes to do here much as they will? Again you say, Nay, Eru is one, alone without peer, and he made Ea and is beyond it. And the Valar are greater than we, but yet no nearer to his majesty. Is this not so?" "Yes," said Finrod, "we say this, and the Valar we know, and they say the same, all save one. But which, think you, is more likely to lie, those who make themselves humble, or he that exalts himself?" So what I want to highlight there, it keeps going, and it's a really wonderful passage. In fact, Christopher at one point remarked that Tolkien's intention was to include this at one point as part of the Silmarillion, right? So you almost think of like Quenta Silmarillion, Calabaith of the Rings of Power in the Third Age, and this dialogue at the end. For some reason, it wasn't included. We won't go into that there right now. But anyway, this is an important writing in Tolkien's mind. And so Andreth, let's highlight this passage here where Andreth says, "They say that the One will himself enter into Arda and heal men and all the marring from the beginning to the end. This they say also, or they feign, and it is a rumor that has come down through years uncounted, even from the days of our undoing." So, and she's referring here to the people of the Old Hope, these men of the Old Hope. So we see here that this idea that Eru, right, God, right, the all-powerful God figure in the Middle Earth legendarium, will enter into the story of Middle Earth, right, to heal men and all the marring from the beginning to the end, right. This is what the people of the Old Hope proclaim. So this goes way back even to the like first awakening of men, even kind of like the prehistory of men in Middle Earth. Okay, there's this rumor, there's this idea that Eru, the One, will enter into Arda in some way, and that's exactly what Christians celebrate on Christmas, right? It's the incarnation of Christ. God, the second person of the Trinity, God Himself, enters into our world as one of us and becomes one of us, walks among us, heals us by His death and eventual resurrection. And we see that Tolkien here was kind of, it's really fascinating to think about exactly what he was trying to do here. But essentially, he's trying to connect his entire work to the story of Christianity. And so when we go back to On Fairy Stories and he's speaking of like the Gospels as a fairy story, he's not saying these stories aren't true. He's not saying, oh, they're these fantasies. He's saying that they are they are like the greater fairy story, the greater fantasy that's actually true, right? This is one of the ideas that he communicated to C.S. Lewis in the 20s and kind of helped Lewis along on the path from atheism to becoming, eventually becoming a Christian. So this idea that the gospel is kind of the greatest of all fairy tales, right? But it's not. But that's not just said in a mocking way. Okay, that's said in a way of like utter joy and respect that it's the fairy tale that actually became true, right? It's the fairy tale that's actually true, and in a way, it lends truth to all of the other great fairy tales.